They posted an HOA eviction notice on my cabin door at 2 a.m. on Veterans Day. Name's Tolland Mercer, retired federal field instructor living quiet by Wickery Lake. Their mistake. They never noticed the laminated map nailed above the breaker box, the one with a federal seal dry and shining under the floodlight. Ever seen someone push too far, not knowing who they just messed with? I saw them long before they knew I was watching. The motion camera pinged at 2:13 a.m. Just a soft pulse on my wristband, but it might as well have been a thunderclap in my bones. I rolled from bed without switching on a light. Years in the bureau had trained my muscles to move before my mind fully caught up. Habit, like old scars, never really fades. I padded barefoot to the desk in the corner of the cabin, pulled up the feed. There they were, 3 shapes moving low and slow, rifles slung backward like hikers who'd lost the trail. Except there was no trail, and no one hikes toward a federal training compound at 2 in the morning. The fog sat heavy outside, blanketing the pines in stillness. That kind of silence isn't peaceful, it's loaded. I'd learned to read silence like a ledger. I didn't reach for the phone. The sheriff's office had a good heart and slow feet. Instead, I keyed the handheld radio on the desk. "Keller," I said, voice low. "We've got company. Coming from the Lake Road southeast tree line. 3. Armed. Moving cautious but not military." There was a beat of static, then her voice, calm, clipped. "Roger that. My team's in position behind the ridge. Visual confirmed. Hold tight." I turned down the volume and watched. The men kept moving, brushing past the edge of the brush line like they owned the place. One of them paused at a tree stump where an old metal sign used to hang. I'd taken it down a week ago after it had been torn clean in half, probably by some genius with bolt cutters. It had said private property, not part of Lakeside HOA. Guess that clarification hadn't stuck. The tallest of the 3 leaned in to whisper something. The camera mic only caught fragments. Eileen said squatters and clean 'em out quiet. That was the first time her name slipped out like a knife dropped in the dark. I froze, not out of fear, but calculation. Eileen Casterbridge, president of the Lakeside HOA, self-appointed queen of neat hedges and passive threats, and now apparently local warlord commissioning armed visits. Keller's voice crackled in again, low and urgent. "You hearing this?" she said. Then came another sound, not hers. A walkie-talkie, close to one of the men's vests. A woman's voice played on loop, clipped and commanding. "Clear the property by sunrise. I don't want to see a trace. Not a warning. Not a suggestion. A directive." The 3 men hesitated just short of the tree line, then dropped as if a rug had been pulled from under them. One screamed. The other 2 were yanked off their feet in the dark by hands they hadn't seen. Keller's team didn't joke around. I stepped out onto the porch only once the clear signal came through. The night still hung heavy dew, thick in the air. From where I stood, I could see the ghost glow of the camera LED and the distant shimmer of tactical lights heading downhill. The log cabin behind me stood quiet, intact, untouched. Keller met me halfway up the slope, breath misting in the cold. "What the hell was that?" she asked. "One of your locals, apparently," I said. "Name's Eileen Casterbridge." She cocked her head, "And she is president of our HOA." I said deadpan. "She just orchestrated an armed trespass into a federal training zone." Keller blinked. "Does she know what this place is?" I looked past her out toward the trees where dawn was still a rumor and the fog refused to lift. "No," I said, "but she's about to learn." By the time the fog burned off, I was already walking the half-mile into town, boots crunching against gravel damp from a long October mist. Wickery Hollow didn't believe in sidewalks or speed limits, just porch swings and judgmental glances from rocking chairs. And then I saw it. New sign. Fresh wood. Letters stenciled in crisp HOA blue, Lakeside Haven, HOA. Private access only. Someone had hammered it right into the trailhead where hikers and kids used to shortcut to the lake. It wasn't just a sign, it was a message. The bell above Maudine's cafe jingled as I pushed the door open. Inside, the smell of chicory coffee and buttermilk biscuits clung to the walls like old music. She was behind the counter wiping down a jar of cinnamon sticks that hadn't sold since the Bush administration. "You're late," she said without looking up, "and you missed the morning drama." "Can't imagine topping last night," I said. "Trespassers, walkie-talkies. HOA sabotage. The usual." She smirked, finally meeting my eyes. "Well, Eileen's been busy. Real busy. Asking the clerk about your tax records, specifically why your land got exempted back in '89. I leaned against the bar. "That information public?" "Not easily," Maudine said, pouring coffee into a thick ceramic mug with a faded elk on it. "But Eileen has a gift. She can make anything feel like her property, including the county archive." I took the mug and sat near the window. Outside, leaves flared copper against the glass, and somewhere a weed trimmer buzzed like a warning. I sipped slowly. "She thinks she can annex the cabin. She thinks a lot of things," Maudine said, "but she's rattled. You didn't call the sheriff last night, did you know?" She gave a satisfied nod. "Good. They'd just bumble it." Rachel Davis walked in just then, cheeks pink from the cold. She gave me a small wave and hesitated before coming to the counter. "Hey, Tolland," she said. "Eileen said you might be headed this way." I raised an eyebrow. "Did she also mention sending armed men to my property?" Rachel froze. "No, I think that must be some misunderstanding. I'm out mapping parcels today. Boundary tape, trail markers, HOA stuff." I took another sip of coffee. "Is my land on your list?" Rachel's hands fidgeted with the tape measure clipped to her belt. "I mean, sort of. Eileen asked us to verify some things like the 1989 exemption." Her face paled. She didn't mention that date. I stood, thanked Maudine, and walked out without another word. Down by the lake, I spotted Diego. The kid was perched on a tree stump with a notebook jotting down bird calls, I assumed. He looked up and waved. "Hey, Mr. Mercer. Weird question, was someone from your family at the library yesterday?" "No," I said slowly. "Why?" He flipped his notebook shut. "Some guy was digging through old land records on the microfiche reader. I overheard the librarian say he was researching property carve-outs. Sounded sketchy." I walked home slower than usual. The woods didn't feel welcoming today, too quiet. I noticed the trail sign again from a different angle. The red paint looked almost smug. Back at the cabin, I went straight to the old filing cabinet in the pantry behind the mason jars of dried lentils and disaster rations. Drawer 3. Folder marked County Assessor, Land Status. The paper was older than Rachel, yellowed at the edges. My grandfather's handwriting in the corner, and there stamped in black, "Not annexed by Lakeside HOA. Confirmed by County Assessor 1989. Not a copy, not hearsay, the real thing." Paper had a weight that email couldn't match. I laid it on the kitchen table. For a long moment, I just stared at it, listening to the low hum of the cabin, the slow tick of the barometer above the sink. Somewhere out there, Eileen was building a case, but I had the truth, in ink and seal. I called Byron Meeks using a number so old it still had a Raleigh area code burned into its bones. He picked up on the third ring. "Tolland," he said, voice like gravel in a steel cup. "Haven't heard that growl in 20 years. What kind of trouble?" I smiled in spite of myself. The slow kind. Property lines, HOA, threats, bad signage. He exhaled like he was putting down a load. "Where are you? I'm driving." 2 hours later, I pulled into a parking lot with more potholes than pavement. The old diner squatted between a vape shop and a shuttered taxidermy studio. Inside, nothing had changed since '92. Rusted license plates hung above every booth. The ketchup bottles were sticky from use, and the waitress called everyone honey, whether you smiled or not. Byron was already seated at the booth farthest from the windows, a battered manila folder open in front of him. He wore a flannel shirt that might have once been red and a ball cap that had survived at least 4 presidential administrations. His eyes were sharp as always, those of a man who never left a room without knowing every exit. "You look older," he said. "You look exactly the same." "Liar. We got coffee thick and burnt." I slid the deed across the table. Byron read it without a word, then took out a yellow notepad and began scribbling codes from memory. "County stamp's legit," he muttered. "But here's the problem. Rachel texted you yet." "About parcel overlays?" I asked. "Yeah. Said the HOA is using new GIS data." He nodded. "It's the oldest new trick in the book. Redraw the boundaries using satellite layers claim the older deeds were based on faulty topography. You'd be amazed how many people fold when a shiny map shows their porch suddenly sits inside community jurisdiction. They can't do that legally. No, Byron said, but they can do it loudly. You'd be surprised what quiet pressure plus shiny paperwork can accomplish, especially when nobody fights back." He pulled out an old topographic map from his folder layered with red pen lines that looked hand-drawn. "This," he said, tapping the faded USGS logo in the corner, "is from when we first mapped the training perimeter. Your land was just outside, but the new overlays, if they're tweaking elevation lines or floodplain status, they can fudge it. On purpose." He nodded slowly. "Tolland, HOA might just be the storefront. Someone wants your land consolidated, cleaned, and under paper control. I've seen this game before. They shift the edges, then come the easements, then come the buyouts." We sat in silence, the clink of forks and a Patsy Cline song filling the space. My phone buzzed. A text from Keller got confirmation. "HOA filed request for jurisdictional review of your parcel. County assessor flagged it. They're pushing hard." Byron leaned forward. "You're sitting on something worth buying. Or burning." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a flash drive, and slid it across the table. "From back when we mapped the zone," he said. "Has the real perimeters before anyone started trimming maps to fit their fences." Back at the cabin, the wind had picked up. A storm was building subtle at first, the kind that rearranges leaves before it breaks branches. I came inside to find Diego crouched near the pantry shelf, fiddling with the old walkie-talkie we'd recovered from the trespassers. He looked sheepish. "Sorry, Mr. Mercer. I bumped the volume wheel and it just played." He handed it to me. The voice crackled through the speaker, distorted but clear enough. "Just get that dog paper filed. Nobody checks signatures." Eileen. My jaw clenched. Dog paper. Keller had mentioned something about forged documents tied to a rescue project, Paws of Grace. I hadn't thought it mattered. I set the walkie down as someone knocked at the front door twice, then a third time, with bureaucratic patience. Outside stood a woman in a navy windbreaker and HOA badge clipped to her collar. She handed me a cream envelope with a slight tremble in her fingers. "Final warning. Non-compliance will result in enforcement action." I didn't open it right away, just stood there watching her walk away down the gravel path, shoes crunching like punctuation marks on the end of a sentence I hadn't agreed to. Behind me, Byron's flash drive sat quietly on the table waiting to speak. Rachel knocked just before dusk, a single sharp rap that didn't quite fit the quiet of the woods. When I opened the door, she stood there with her arms crossed tightly. Manila envelope pressed to her chest. Her hand was shaking. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I think I screwed up." The porch light buzzed overhead, casting her face in a warm amber that couldn't hide the color draining from her cheeks. I stepped aside. "Come in." She entered like someone crossing a border they didn't have a passport for. Diego looked up from the kitchen table where he'd been flipping through one of Byron's maps. Rachel nodded to him, then sat on the edge of the couch like the cushions might bite. Outside, the fog thickened. Inside, the fire crackled soft and slow. "I brought this," she said, handing me the envelope. "It's the updated HOA boundary map, the one Eileen told me to deliver." I slid it out and unfolded the pages across the kitchen table. The lines were bold, bright red. A box was drawn around my property around me. "She said it was approved by the county," Rachel added. "Said it was just a formality." I turned the map toward the light and frowned. "There's no date here, no file number, no assessor stamp." She blinked. When I flipped it over, blank. County maps always carry metadata. Lot references, approval history, public access index. This looks like it was made in PowerPoint." Diego leaned in, eyebrows raised. "Look here," he said, pointing to a corner. "The footer says, Draft 7, not for distribution." Rachel went pale. "She told me it was final," she murmured. "She said just hand it off quietly. Don't make waves." The walkie-talkie on the counter hissed. I turned to it slowly, a tight knot forming in my chest. Diego picked it up and adjusted the volume. Static. Then a voice, Eileen's again. "Don't let anyone see the dog papers. It's my signature, nobody'll trace it." Rachel's eyes snapped to me. What did she just say? I didn't answer right away. I went to the cabinet near the pantry, pulled down a folder labeled Adoptions. HOA Committee. Inside, a stack of documents neatly filed. Near the top, the intake form for Bishop the shaggy brown retriever we'd rescued 2 years back. HOA had made it a community initiative. I slid the form onto the table. Diego took one look and said Eileen signed as Director of Animal Programs. "There's no such position," I muttered, "at least not in any of the bylaws." Rachel nodded slowly. She told me it was informal, just a placeholder title, but she used that form to get vendor access. She ordered supplies, opened a line of credit. She forged authority, I said, used a fake title to create a paper trail. Now she's trying to bury the evidence. The fireplace cracked behind us. Something about the heat made the moment more surreal, like the truth had been hiding in the warmth all along. Rachel took a breath and looked at the boundary map again. "There's more. Eileen told me to avoid the post office, to hand these maps directly person to person. No emails, no record. Why, I asked. Because Franklin Oak, your old lawyer, he told her in 2000 that your land wasn't annexable, that any attempt to draw you into HOA would be unenforceable. But Eileen said—" Rachel trailed off. "Said what?" "She said no one would dig that deep, that nobody had time to argue over old dog adoption forms or land deeds, that people don't read footnotes." I tapped the walkie-talkie, which still sat humming faintly. "They're going to hear every word of this," I said, whether they read or not. My phone buzzed on the counter. Keller again. I answered. "Yeah." His voice came through low but urgent. "If we can find the original adoption form, the one submitted to the county registry, Eileen might have voided her own HOA. I looked at the paper in front of me. Faint ink. A clipped signature. The kind of thing most people would shred after 2 years. "Then we find it," I said. Rachel looked like she wanted to leave and stay all at once. The wind outside picked up rustling the pine needles in the darkness beyond the cabin windows. "You okay?" I asked her. She hesitated. "I didn't mean for any of this. I know I said. But knowing doesn't erase it, and the map Draft 7 still lay open on the table, red lines bleeding across land that never belonged to them." Rachel showed up just past 7, hair damp from fog, her eyes already glassy. She didn't knock, just stood on my porch, then sank to her knees before I could reach the door. "They burned a cabin," she whispered. "Last night, off Pine Hook Road. I think I'm next." Her hands shook. Not the kind of tremble that comes from cold, something deeper. Something wired into the spine when you realize people aren't playing games anymore. I helped her inside, made a cup of coffee the way Maudine taught me. Slow pour, not too hot. She cupped it like it was a lifeline. Diego stood in the corner, not saying a word. That alone told me this was serious. I pulled up the map. Pine Hook was only a half-mile south. I'd hunted deer near there in '08. Quiet slope, no power lines. One access road. "I thought it was empty land," I said. "Used to be," Rachel replied. "But someone set up a temporary build. No permits, just a prefab shell. Started last month. Who owned it?" She shook her head. "Nobody official." I grabbed my coat. The air still held pine smoke when Diego and I reached the site. The shell had collapsed in on itself, charred boards curling like the pages of an unread book. Ash fanned across the moss, dusting the low shrubs in a sickly gray. No tape, no responders, just soot and silence. "Looks deliberate," Diego muttered. "Looks practiced," I said. He crouched and picked up a hinge plate. "Clean break, no rust." "New materials," he added. We circled the lot. I spotted faint tire tracks in the mud, parallel tight turning like someone reversed in a hurry. And then my phone buzzed. Voicemail from Franklin Oak. I played it back on speaker. You ever heard of Harmony Front Holdings? You should. Look at Parcel 12B on the East Ridge. They're not real owners, they're placeholders. Something's off. Be careful. I turned to Diego. Franklin doesn't call unless something's bleeding. Back at the cabin, I found a binder Franklin had left tucked behind my porch swing. Inside, land parcel printouts, old title transfers, and one sheet circled in red. Harmony Front Holdings. Incorporated in Delaware. Mailing address a UPS store in Asheville. No human name attached. I flipped to the next page. It was my property, technically still mine, but highlighted in yellow with a sticky note that read, Contingent Option. Pending enforcement. Contingent on what exactly? Keller called in around noon. You're not going to like this, he began. Try me. Our drone feed from last Thursday, it was cut. Cut how somebody scrambled our telemetry. Precise surgical, like they knew where we'd be looking. I let that sit for a moment. A silence filled the line, sharp as frost. She's got help, I said finally. Not amateurs, Keller replied. At 3:47 p.m., the HOA website went offline. By 4:10, Rachel texted me from town Eileen's not taking calls. Her car's gone from her usual lot. By 4:35, I'd found the car. Parked outside a squat brick office just off I-40. The sign above the door read Pine Ridge Development Group. A receptionist in a mauve cardigan smiled blandly when I asked for Eileen. I'm sorry, who Eileen Casterbridge. No one by that name works here. I glanced behind her hallway closed doors, a faint scent of copier ink. Nothing to grab. Mind if I leave a note? She blinked. Sure. I left a post-it with 2 words. You're unraveling. Rachel was waiting when I got back. She'd stopped crying, but her eyes were ringed in the kind of exhaustion you only earn from betrayal. I kept a copy, she said, of the dog adoption form, Bishop's intake, the real one, with Eileen's signature. She wrote it as Director Community Affairs. That title never existed, not in any bylaws, not even in drafts. I checked. You're sure? Rachel opened her bag and pulled out a clear sleeve. Inside, a scan of the form, time-stamped, notarized with Eileen's name right there in blue ink. She filed it while not holding office. That voids every authority-based action she took after Rachel added, and she knew it. I exhaled through my nose slow. This wasn't just about HOA overreach anymore. This was fraud on paper with names, titles, timelines, and someone had burned a cabin to keep it quiet. Okay, I said, turning toward the cabinet. I pulled out Byron's flash drive. Then it's time we finish the puzzle. Outside, the fog had started to roll back, lifting off the ridge like smoke from a long, cold fire, but we weren't anywhere near done. I set the tripod, low-tilted slightly up toward the porch rail where I stood. My breath came out in white wisps, catching the weak dawn light bleeding across Wickery Lake. The fog hadn't lifted, and neither had the weight on my chest. Go live in 5, Keller said through the headset. His voice clipped precise. Say it plain. No theatrics, just the truth. Copy that, I muttered, then checked the feed. Diego gave me a thumbs up from inside the cabin, one hand still adjusting the brightness settings on the overlay slides. Rachel sat cross-legged beside him, papers fanned around her like she was grading a midterm. The battery pack hummed beside my boot green light steady. I wasn't used to talking to a lens. But I'd briefed senators through one-way glass. I'd testified with 3-star brass, taking notes behind mirrored panels. I could do this. For once, I wasn't reporting up the chain. I was reporting out. Good morning, I said, voice steady. My name is Tolland Mercer. This cabin sits just outside the jurisdiction of the Lakeside Haven HOA in Wickery Hollow, North Carolina. I've owned it outright since 1989. You've probably seen the posts on Nextdoor or maybe the rumors floating around town. It's time to clear the fog. I held up the parcel deed, its faded ink visible as Diego focused the camera. This is the land exemption filed in 1989, notarized and certified by the county assessor. It clearly states, not annexed by Lakeside HOA. Never was, never will be. Rachel passed me the next sheet, her hands shaking slightly. I kept talking. You've also probably heard rumors about illegal dumping, trespassing, and threats made in HOA newsletters. But what you haven't seen yet is how that story was manipulated. I reached to the walkie-talkie we'd rigged for playback. A scratch of static. Then Eileen's voice filled the porch. Just get that dog paper filed. Nobody checks signatures. That's the voice of Eileen Casterbridge, acting head of the HOA. Here's the form in question. I held up the dog adoption certificate signed by Eileen 3 months after her term had expired. The corner was crumpled, but the ink was clear. Beneath her name, HOA Authorization Officer, a role that didn't exist. This document was submitted to the county shelter giving the HOA proxy rights over a rescue project titled Paws of Grace. Problem is, she wasn't authorized to sign, wasn't even holding office at the time, but the dogs kept coming and the money kept moving. Rachel tapped Diego's screen. The parcel overlays popped up our land in green HOA boundaries in blue and in bright red lots purchased quietly under a shell company called Harmony Front Holdings. These filings show 12 purchases in the past 2 years, all within 2 miles of the lake, I said. All routed through Harmony Front. Here's the kicker. A pause. I looked square into the lens. Eileen's name doesn't appear anywhere on the filings, but the registered agent for Harmony Front is a man named Dennis McElroy. He's her brother-in-law, and a developer. The viewer chat began scrolling faster. I caught a few phrases. She forged HOA powers. Where's the county in this class action? Keller's voice broke in again. We're at 200,000 views. Monroe confirms Harmony Front's main account just froze. SEC issued an alert. I exhaled slowly. Not joy, not even relief, just the next breath after holding it too long. Rachel stepped forward, whispering, "Should we go offline now?" Before I could answer, Diego's laptop pinged. Breaking. Eileen Casterbridge arrested outside Roadway Inn near Asheville. The photo showed her in a fleece pullover, hair damp, one hand shielding her face. Underneath a quote from her booking, I was just trying to fix what was broken. I sat down hard on the porch steps. The fog still hadn't lifted, but something had shifted. A seam in the silence finally torn open. Rachel's cabin didn't make it through the night, but Rachel did. She was across county lines, curled under a quilt Keller's wife had sewn, breathing in the silence of safety. I stood by the ashes that morning, snow falling in slow, awkward spirals. The beams still smoked skeletal against the pines. She'd built that cabin herself, hammered every nail, planted the rhododendrons that now stood wilted, dusted in soot. Rachel walked up beside me. Her coat was too thin for the weather, but her spine held like iron. "I'm not leaving," she said. I know I answered and meant it. She bent down, picked up a piece of scorched siding, and stared at the blackened edge. They meant to scare me. They failed. Behind us, Diego paced, holding a tablet against his chest. His face was flushed with the kind of discovery you don't want to make, but can't ignore. "They filed it 2 days ago," he said, handing me the screen. It was a permit, Harmony Front Holdings, LLC, requesting preliminary testing rights for lithium extraction beneath Wickery Lake's northern basin. Parcel number matched Rachel's land. Submitted 48 hours after our live stream, timestamped in a window where they likely assumed no one would be watching the filings. I passed it to Rachel. She didn't flinch, just nodded. "It was never about HOA dues," she muttered. "It was about minerals." Later that afternoon, Monroe met us in the library's old reading room, its green lamps still casting shadows like secrets. He looked worn, a step behind himself. The county board, he began not sitting. They approved exploratory partnerships last year. Harmony Front was 1, but the minutes of that vote were sealed, classified under development strategy. "You can unseal them?" I asked. He shrugged. "I can request." "Then request," Rachel said, "and I'll be sitting in the front row when you do." That night, after Rachel settled into the pop-up tent near what was left of her porch, I drove back to the cabin. A single envelope waited on the doormat. No return address, just my name in faded black ink. Inside, a photocopy of 3 county deeds, mine Rachel's, and a third lot further east. All stamped verified. Still ours. Tucked between the pages was a yellow post-it in Byron's handwriting, "Deeds filed. Still yours." The man had a way with brevity. My phone buzzed as I refolded the documents. Monroe again. "They're gone," he said. "Harmony Front's CEO booked a charter flight this morning. Private. Destination unknown." I didn't respond right away. I looked out over the lake. Fog curled across the surface like a long exhale. Somewhere in the dark, Bishop, the rescued mutt, howled once and then went silent. Then came the knock. Not heavy, not urgent, just a polite tap. On the porch stood a courier. He wore brown gloves and looked half-frozen. He handed me a certified envelope and jogged back to his truck. Inside, a temporary mining permit. Dated October 19th, the day before our live stream. I read it twice. Then I reached for the fire poker, stirred the hearth, and watched the first flicker of flame take hold. They asked me to say a few words. I kept it short. No podium, no speech. Just me, a folding chair, and Bishop's old collar in my hand. "You can burn a cabin," I said, voice low, "but you can't burn this town's spine." They nodded, not clapping, just standing there quiet. Wind rustled the paws of Grace banner above us, newly printed bright blue, flapping beside the tent like a flag that had always belonged. The memorial was modest. That's how Rachel wanted it. The footprint of her old cabin lay behind us, framed in wild azaleas and a rope of solar lanterns. She kept one wall, the only one that didn't collapse. Charred black, it still stood like a scar you don't hide. "For memory," she said. A line of neighbors wound past the table where Diego sat, beaming. In front of him were flyers, bone-shaped bookmarks, and a small plaque, Bishop Memorial Fund, for Rescue for Justice. A little girl handed him a $5 bill wrapped in a drawing of a dog with wings. Diego looked up at me. "They picked me. Picked you." I smiled. "For the Appalachian Public Fellowship. Full ride. Environmental law track. Starting fall." I reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder. Then we did something right. Keller wandered over with a paper plate full of barbecue beans and a borrowed cowboy hat. "Monroe sends his regrets," he said. "Stuck, wrangling a county upstate that just discovered their HOA's been laundering gravel fees into billboard companies. Copycats, emboldened incompetents. But they know we're watching now." He handed me a laminated brochure. On the cover, Rachel Bishop and a group of volunteers cleaning up trails by the lake. "Paws of Grace, a rescue and rights initiative." I sat back down and let the scene fill me. Kids chasing each other through the grass. Maudine fussing with a coffee urn. The town mayor trying not to drop coleslaw on his shirt. Rachel laughing for the first time in months. I'd spent my whole life thinking justice had to come with badges with trials and transcripts and someone pounding a gavel. But sometimes it looks like this. A dog's collar in a case. A notarized paper on a folding table. A lake reflecting clean sky. The collar had Bishop's name stitched in fading thread. I slid the adoption form in behind it. The same form Eileen had signed under the wrong authority, the one that undid her. The one that proved she wasn't just cruel, but careless. That truth, fragile as it was, had survived fire and silence and static, and now it sat clear and undeniable beside a memory that wagged its tail at every child who walked past. Rachel joined me at the display. Her hand brushed mine. "We didn't win everything," she said. "No," I said, "but we won the things that mattered." Farther off, I saw Byron leaning against his truck. He didn't wave, just tipped his chin. I nodded back. The man liked his exits clean. Wind picked up again. Somewhere in the trees a single bark echoed out sharp, full-throated. It wasn't Bishop, but it carried the same note. Not fear, not warning, just presence. Just I'm here. I stood still and let it ring. The breeze off Wickery Lake had a different tone that evening, less like warning, more like a song you almost forgot you knew. I watched the collar glint inside the display case, no longer just evidence, but memory made solid. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through a cracked wall left standing through neighbors who bring casserole and sit with you in the smoke. I used to think lines on a map defined belonging. Turns out it's the people who show up after the fire. Have you ever had a second chance disguised as loss share your story or stick around? This porch is always open.